Why South Sudan? An Every Village podcast where we answer questions about the world's youngest nation. The question of the day is how many tribes are in South Sudan and which ones do we work with? Hello, everyone. My name is Tiana Johnston, and I am the host of this podcast called Why South Sudan. We are back here for another episode with our special guest, Blake Jones.
Hey again, great to be here.
I thought we're on just such a roll, so I said, you know what? I think he should come back and give his wise wisdom on this next question. So the question is, how many tribes are in South Sudan?
Yeah, it's a fun question to answer because it's kind of shocking sometimes to note that we always say 64 tribes, and I think there are some other classifications that you could look around and find, maybe 80, or they may call it people groups, but when we talk about the South Sudan, we say 64 tribes. And what I like seeing people look in people's faces, because as you might remember, South Sudan is the size of Texas, roughly, from a geographical area. And imagine 64 different people groups being in a area the size of Texas. Now, these people groups vary wildly sometimes from one person group to another, or they're pretty similar but have some distinctive traits about the tribal group. So, if you drove from Houston to Dallas, you could cross 10 or 15 different distinct ethnic groups across on that drive alone, which is pretty wild, which means distinct language groups and tribal customs. And even within that, there are clans that are unique and have different customs. So pretty cool, though. So we say 64, and then, of course, 64 languages. And before I jump into who we work among and where we broadcast to, I would point you to a really cool resource for the listener, which is the Joshua Project. So type that into Google, and it's amazingly detailed with the tribal groups, the unreached. What the Joshua Project does is they track the percentage reach of Christianity of people groups around the world. And so they break it down into ethnicity, into different classifications. So they have like the affinity type, the people cluster, and then the people group. And so you can see they break that down. You can drill into South Sudan, and I think they have like 80 groups listed. So there are some really small ones that maybe some other organizations combine into people groups, or the South Sudanese government would. But a really cool resource where you can see these people groups, the languages they speak, where they live in the geography of South Sudan. And I would highly recommend you go check it out for the listener.
Yeah, that actually is. I've actually never seen that website,
Yeah.
so I'm excited to check it out.
Yeah, it's a really cool website. So 64 tribal groups. Every village works with specifically the two largest people groups, the Dinka, which is the largest, and the Nuer, the second largest. And then we work with some smaller tribal groups as well in the areas where we operate our compounds. So in Mavolo, the people group there is called the Jormado. And then there's a smaller tribal group that we work with a little bit called the Jorbeli there as well. In Tanj, we work with the Dinka. That's the primary group in that area, as well as in Awil. But in Tanj, there's some smaller tribal groups, one called the Luo, and then one called the Bongo that we also work with. But primarily in those locations I just mentioned, Mavolo, Tanj, and Awil, it's the Jormado and the Dinka. And then on the eastern part of the country, where I mentioned Nasser, our first missionary compound in 2013, that tribal group is called the Nuer, which is the second largest group in the country. And so we, of course, include them, even though we're just now getting that location back up and running.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the radio broadcast, we do in Dinka, in Jormado, in Bongo a little bit, and in Luo, although there are some changes that are taking place there in terms of our radio broadcast in Tanj. And then, of course, when we get Nasser back up and running, we'll have Nuer to the list.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's kind of two main tribal broad tribal categories in South Sudan. You have the Nilotic people and the Sudanic people, and then there's also a little bit of Bantu, which is a group that's largely associated with East Africa and even in West Africa. But there's some small Bantu populations in South Sudan. But where every village feels called and we feel really focused is the Nilotic regions of the country.
Mm-hmm.
This is the by far the largest tribal group in the country, and we feel called there primarily just because of geography, as Andrew I'm sure has mentioned. Uh, in the Nilotic regions of the country are in general the least accessible or least reachable places in the country, and so we really want to focus our efforts there and focus our efforts on the largest tribal groups, which are the Dinka and the Nuer. And so, but right now the Dinka makes up vast majority of our broadcast coverage is covering the Dinka peoples, and we're broadcasting in the Dinka language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do we also, because I know there was a question of, do we also broadcast in English or Arabic or any other common, I guess, common language that they know?
Yeah, at times we will, but very rarely. We really want the radio broadcast to be done in the heart language of the local people. So you've heard about our model at every village. And radio is really the beginning of that because all the ministry takes place within the coverage area of the radio stations. And we want that to be done in the local language of the people in that coverage area. And so the vast majority of our broadcasts is in that local language, depending on where you are in the country. But English and is technically one of the national languages of South Sudan because they were a British, not full colony, but a British protectorate, and so there's a high English influence there. And then they speak what's called Juba Arabic. Most people in the country would call that also one of the second language of the country, that trade is done and that sort of thing. And then there's some pockets of Swahili that is spoken, which is spoken across East Africa as well. So those are the main, I guess, technically the national languages of the country. But when you're on the ground, you're going to hear the tribal languages that are spoken. And then when you started doing cross-tribal stuff, like we have, it's really cool to see because we have, our locations in Tanj and Awil, they speak Dinka, and then you have our guys in Mavolo who speak Jormado. I mean, when they speak, they get together. It's pretty crazy. They are using this sort of combination of Juba Arabic and English, sort of, but sometimes one person can hear Dinka, but they can't speak Dinka. The other person can hear Jormado, but can't speak it. And so they're just this cross. It's really amazing to see it. Obviously, when we're there, I don't know what they're saying, but it's amazing to see these two distinct tribal groups communicating in a really adaptable fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I lived there, or even just visiting, literally people knew like 5 languages. They were fluent in 5 languages, and that just blows my mind, especially for us in America. How many languages are you fluent in?
Yeah, 1.
Same, guilty.
I dabble in several others, but it's a hard dabble.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your French is quite, I think it's,
Merci.
you tricked me. I thought you were really good at
it. Yeah. It's a bit like, in Switzerland, they can speak all kinds of languages. They just grow up knowing 5 languages, like German and French and English and probably Spanish and Italian. It's kind of like that. And just if you're a South Sudanese person, you grow up at least somewhat close to a town, you're gonna know 3 or 4 languages. And our staff are amazing. They're constantly teaching us how to speak, and we have one staff member, Archangelo, who's really dedicated to making sure that we know how to speak Dinka. Yes. And he's tremendously proficient in English and Arabic, and of course his native tongue Dinka, but he's a great teacher and a hard driver of how to pronounce words in Dinka. And so that's one of the fun things about going on a trip too, is you just get to learn, greetings in different languages. And, if you're on a trip and you travel to 3 different locations, you're going to learn the greetings of 3 different areas. And so it's really funny on a trip, specifically on these survey trips where you're seeing all the country, all of our locations across the country. that you've got to get on the ground and learn. Oh shoot, I'm in Nasser now. How do I greet in Nuer? And then you land in Tanj, and you're used to saying Male to greet someone in Nuer, but then you've got to switch to Chiabak, and then you get the
Yeah.
Mavolo, and you've got to switch to a different language. And I find that to be really funny. And you're
Mhm.
gonna for sure greet someone in Nuer when you're in a Dinka area. You know,
It's so true. I love learning the greetings, and also you just see like how much they light up. Like it means so much when you even just attempt. Even though I mean our accents, we sound very
for
American.
sure we do. Yeah,
Our accents are in, and but it just means so much to them, and yeah,
yeah,
it is a lot of fun.
yeah. It's simultaneously very humbling
Yes.
to be in a culture where you're just piecing together communication because it makes you really understand more of what immigrants to our country feel every day. Like
Mhm.
imagine, you know, you hear it a lot with when refugees come over. A lot of refugees are experts in their field. It could be chemistry, biology. They're medical professionals, lawyers in let's say Syria, and they get to America, and because their English is not their native language, it's hard for them to communicate their intelligence and their knowledge.
Mhm.
But it doesn't mean that they don't have it. And it's the same thing. I feel that very much when I travel to South Sudan, is
Mhm.
I have these thoughts and this in my head, but the way that I have to communicate, it's very broken. That's a
Mhm.
very broken way of communicating, and it's a very humbling experience. So it's simultaneously humbling, and I would say also just incredibly rewarding when you attempt to speak the language and attempt to, this something as simple as Tiana said it, but as just a greeting,
Mhm.
and to watch how much that means to the people of South Sudan. They love
Mhm.
it. It's amazing, you know.
Mhm.
And they want to do the same to us. They want to say, kids will walk up to you and, "How are you? What is your name?" They've learned some standard greetings, and that's just what they say. And it's the same for us. We learn how to say that to them, and it's an amazing exchange of
Mhm.
culture.
It is. I think some of my favorite memories too is when you get say the wrong thing. Actually, in February last year, because I hadn't spoken, I mean, Dinka in a while, and so going back, and I was asking my friend Christina for a spoon, but I accidentally asked for a key.
Yeah,
So luckily, she knew what I was saying and what I meant.
yeah.
But the words totally just switched in my brain.
Yeah, for sure. It's a little bit hard to eat oatmeal or rice and beans with a key. So it's good that she was able
Exactly.
to translate it. Yeah, and I'd say our staff again. They, in general, most of our staff know English. Well, they all know English way better than we know any of their
Hmm.
languages. But a lot of our staff, especially our leadership, know English really well, and so it's it's a great way of learning. Someone who knows English well and can teach you their language, and you're just there for a short time, but that's part of the fun of traveling, I
Hmm.
think, is just picking up the language along the way.
Hmm. And
Yeah,
also being willing to be a learner. I think
for
that's
sure.
like a big lens you have to put on because culture is amazing. Culture is so beautiful. Just to see how the Dinka are versus the Jur people versus, I mean, just the Luo, the Bongo. I mean, they're all so different. They specialize in different things.
Yeah,
I know with
that's
the
true.
Luo, like they they produce honey. They like love to harvest honey, and where Dinka and Nuer are more cattle herders. So
Yeah.
it's just every tribe is so different, and I think that's actually really good. If maybe next episode we can dive into what are the differences of the tribes and different regions the the country. Like it looks different for each tribe. So I think maybe next time we'll dive into that.
Yeah, I think that'd be a really good conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, perfect. Well, thanks so much for coming on today again.
of course.
We have something special planned for next episode. We will be answering a listener's question. You heard me right. You actually have the chance to send in your questions of what you want to know about South Sudan, and we will do our best to answer them. So, next episode, we will be answering what are the differences in the 64 tribes. Take care.